So as you can look at from 2019 to 2020, we're basically now at 51% of our varieties at a lower risk of leaf spot. So I think that's made a big difference. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about higher sugar yield. So sugar is always depends on the weather, and that's a big factor as we go forward. So if you remember back to last year, we had that very early planting. So that was pretty exciting when we had those beets in the ground in March. Unfortunately, we lost a lot of them to freeze. I wouldn't change that going forward. I think it's still worth the risk. I think if we could have got more of those make it through, it would have been really exciting. But we still were able to, with the early planting, we were still able to plant 95% and replant most of our fields by April 30th. So that was a good timing. We got beets in the ground early, and that made a big difference. As I mentioned with the freeze, we probably had the most replant acres in a long time. So about around 20% of our acres were replanted. So that was a significant amount. But still, we had some great opportunity to be able to replant by April 30th. As we remember, we had those heavy rains and flooding during emergence. So that was a real issue, particularly for the West group. With that came seedling disease, aphanomycetes. We also had a higher risk of rhizoc and fusarium. And so that was definitely impacted us this year when we look at some of those root diseases. We also, if we remember, we had a wet early growing season. So we were really concerned about leaf spot going into June with the wet weather we had and warm weather. So there was a high weather risk for leaf spot as well. We had variable weather throughout the growing season. So the east was very dry. The west and central were generally a bit wetter, but definitely that dry weather kind of capped the yield for some of the growers in the east, unfortunately. We also had a cooler and drier fall, so that was some good news. We were able to harvest fairly well, and the cooler weather, I think, definitely helped us with our sugar. So just looking back, this is some 2018 data, so I just wanted to show you 2018 and compare that to 19 to 20. 2018 was a higher tonnage year, a lower sugar year, and so a couple trends I think worth looking at. So the red line indicates the average temperature through the growing season. The blue bars indicate the rainfall per day. So a couple trends that you'll notice off the top is, one, with rainfall, we received quite a bit of rainfall right around harvest. So that was a bit of a, when we get that happening, sometimes that can impact, one, harvest conditions, but also our ability to gain sugar and to gain sugar. At the same time, that is an opportunity for yield growth. So if it's warmer and wetter in the fall, we generally can get a little bit of more of a yield uptick. But as you look in general, you'll see the trends. Our growing season, we're about the same for each of those seasons. So as I look at the 70-degree weather, we kind of bounced a little bit above, below, right around 70 degrees for the growing season. But then as we got into harvest, kind of had this slow decline in temperature. In fact, if you start looking at the 60-degree mark, you can see we really didn't start dropping below 60 degrees till we got into about the mid-September to late or early October time frame in 2018. So looking at the weather trends from 2019, again, you see kind of a similar summer, bounced around that 70-degree mark, although we got a little bit cooler into late August, but we still stayed above 60 for a bit before kind of dropping down into October, below 60. So I think, 2019 was an okay sugar year. Our tonnage was okay, but looking at those trends, we also had some rainfall, as we remember, in 2019 into fall that created a wetter situation for us. So looking at 2020, really, I think if you could look from a climate standpoint, this was probably an ideal year in terms of sugar accumulation late. So 2020 was one of our higher gains on sugar from when we did our last pre-harvest samples to our final sugar content, our final harvest. And so what you'll notice is we kind of had this kind of an even rainfall pattern outside of the heavy rains we had early. We kind of had an even rainfall pattern in general. Again, looking at, it seemed like a cooler summer, but at times we were warmer, at times we were lower. But what you'll notice right as we got into September, as we all remember, it was very cool and got very cool quickly. And I think that contributed a lot to our sugar gains. Okay, so looking at some of the grower yield trends in 2020, our regular delivery growers averaged over 30 tons per acre and nearly 300 RWST. So that was very exciting to see. We had multiple growers achieve that 300 goal on individual fields. So that was also very exciting. So I think if we could have avoided some of these weather extremes in the west and east, 2020 could have even been better. So I want to talk a little bit about reducing risk in seed selection. So in 2019, we had 22 varieties available to plant. We planted 16 of those on 1,000 or more acres and 8 of those on 5,000 or more acres. In 2020, we had 26 varieties to plant. So again, we planted 16 of those on 1,000 or more acres and 7 varieties on 5,000 or more acres. So I think some varieties in that time, they're coming and going. We're making some changes to varieties. There's a lot available, as you guys will see today on the rest of the talk. But in 2021, we have 27 varieties available. And so again, a lot of good varieties out there. I think as growers, you need to think about how you can continue to plant greater genetic diversity on your farm and also take advantage of the RWST increases that we've seen from variety approval. So we had some improvements in variety approval, higher sugar per ton in a lot of varieties. So make sure you consider that as you're looking at varieties. We also have more disease tolerance options than ever. So I know as growers, you've been frustrated with the amount of leaf spot that you've been challenged with and spraying and managing that. So we have more disease tolerance now available than ever, both in conventional varieties as well as you'll see with the new CR Plus varieties that are available out there to take a look at. So a lot of options, a lot of things you can look at for your farm. And so a lot to study in terms of the data. And, as we mentioned, we have all the variety information is online. You'll be seeing a book shortly on that. So feel free to look at that as well as what we'll have today for the presentations. So with that, continue to look at those choices. So make sure you're thinking about our sugar yield and continue to think about diversifying your variety portfolio. And with that, we'll have Brian Grew come up and get more into the data. Thanks, and Brian?
Good morning, everybody. It's a little bit different than normal, but we're glad that we have the participation that we do. Get right into it here. Just wanted to talk for a minute about the minimum and allowable requirements for our variety approval program. This slide here just shows a trend line from where we were in 2008 to where we hope to be in 2025 and beyond, showing a consistent increase over time. And RWST minimum requirements increasing steadily over time as well, trying to get us to that 30 and 300 goal. Our maximal allowed Cercospora levels, you can see where we were in 2007. And then we relaxed those tolerance levels to allow more Roundup Ready varieties. And since that time, our 2010 to 14 plan, we have been steadily decreasing those maximum allowable tolerances to where now in 2020 and beyond, any new varieties will have to fall at or below where we were back in 2007 or 9 before Roundup Ready. So that's exciting. We're going to be having some of our most tolerant varieties ever that'll be available in the near future. New approval requirements that went into effect for varieties that began testing in 2020. We have a new maximum root aphid level. We saw some pretty significant amounts of economic impact over the last few years. So our new maximum root aphid level is 25% based on a trial that's done by Hillshog in Colorado or a trial that we have done in Minnesota by Beta Seed. We also have a new maximum Cercospora level tolerance for specially approved varieties. In the past, we haven't had a maximum tolerance for Cercospora on the special approved varieties, but now we do have this maximum of 113.24. That level was determined by being 10% higher than a fully approved variety. And just to put that in perspective, 113.24 is still below where fully approved varieties were in 2015 to 19. So it's still a relatively good level. New 2025 standards. We released a 5-year goal, so our seed companies know what to work for and what to strive for 2025. The seed committee talked about these and the board of directors approved them. An RWSA increase, currently we're at 91.78, and we're increasing to 97.25. The reason for the large increase there, we're trying to get that to where the seed companies are actually producing seed right now. So it gets us more in line with what's actually being produced right now and being grown by our producers. RWST increase from 99.53 to the 101.82. That increase brings us more in line with where we want to be with 30 and 300. And then a Cercospora decrease from the 102.95 down to a 92.48. So beginning in 2025, being that's 5 years out, varieties submitted then will be as good or better than our best varieties right now. So that's encouraging moving forward. Just a summary of this year's official variety trial program. We planted 8 official variety trials. Of those 8, 5 of them we used for variety approval. This year, with the coronavirus pandemic and labor issues, we planted these trials to stand. Normally we plant them at a 2-inch spacing and then we thin those to around 200 beets per 100 foot. This year we planted trials at 3 3/4 spacing and then left them to stand. These trials had 8 replications of 50 varieties. Quadra supplied both in furrow and foliar at 6 to 8 leaf stage, 6 to 8 fungicide applications for leaf spot control, depending on when the trials were harvested. All trials had very good control. 5 of the trials had good quality. Those were the ones that we used for approval. 2 trials were fair and then 1 was fair to poor. The harvest dates of these trials ranged from September 16th to November 4th. So a pretty good range there. We didn't harvest any earlier than that. We have to wait to harvest any of these trials until our breeders come for the breeders tour, which is during the week of Labor Day. Of the 3 trials that we harvested during permanent pile, we put roots from those into our storage trial for analysis. We'll be taking those out sometime in mid to late February. Just a note for the 3 trials we didn't use for variety approval. Our Richville trial had variable emergence and some root rot that was spotty. Sandusky trial had variable emergence and quite a few gaps. And then our Au Gras trial was subject to multiple rainfall events. Very heavy, 3-inch rain and then another 8 or 9-inch rain not too long after. Even though that these trials were not used for variety approval, we did include them in our research book that's going to print today and should be mailed sometime tomorrow. Cercospora nursery, we planted 3 nurseries this year. 2 of those we used for approval. The 3rd nursery did not end up with enough disease to differentiate between good and poor varieties. These trials were planted at 2-inch spacing and thin to make sure that we didn't have any extra variables leading to their Cercospora levels and ratings. These trials, we never apply any fungicide and we inoculate them at or near row closure. All of the varieties that enter this trial are coded and we do not know what we're looking at when we're rating them. We just have them numbered 1 through 52. We rate these on a 2 to 4 day interval and we typically rate 5 to 7 times. This year, with the slow progression of disease in mid to late August, we actually rated them a few more times. And we will rate these until the worst varieties become completely burned down, the picture you see on the lower right-hand side. Normally, we'll take alternator ratings if the disease presents itself, but this year it did not. All varieties will suffer economic loss if not protected with fungicides, and Dennis has some great slides later on showing you the progression of some of these varieties in these Cercospora nursery trials. Root disease nurseries, 2 nurseries were planted in Michigan, 1 by Michigan Sugar Company and 1 by USDA. The Michigan Sugar Company internal trial this year did not develop enough disease to rate, so all of the ratings for 2020 came from the USDA trial. In addition to the nurseries that we do in Michigan in-house by Michigan Sugar Company, we also contract disease nurseries out to other companies for root aphid, Phantomyces, Fusarium, Rhizomania, and a nematode screening done at MSU in East Lansing. This page, I think you'll see it quite a few times today, and then if you watch the seed company videos later, I think each one of them use it. A lot of information here, all of the varieties that were approved to plant for 2021. I will make note that some of those on there, there are not seed supplies, but we included their data in here. This chart is sorted by dollars per acre, but those dollars per acre will be subject to your ability to control the disease for each variety. A lot of information here. Use the chart wisely, knowing that each variety has its own special characteristics and that may be beneficial to you on your farm. It will be, I think, page 2 or 3 in the book, so you'll be getting those books soon. Getting right into the seed available for each company. ACH seeds, seed available for 2021. 675, very good supply. That's a highly planted variety. It's very high yielding with good quality, good overall disease package. It shows a little bit of susceptibility to fusarium in the nursery trials, but it hasn't shown to be a problem in the field. That variety is #1 on our average of 2 years data. Crystal 752 NT, high yielding and average quality nematode tolerant variety. A little bit better leaf spot tolerance than some of the other high yielding varieties. Also a little bit better rhizoctonia tolerance than nematode varieties of past. That variety was #5 on our average 2 years data. Crystal 855, Andy had said that there's no supply of that for 2021. Crystal 919, good supply. It's a new limited approved variety with very good Cercospora tolerance. This is one of the higher varieties for Cercospora tolerance that doesn't include the new source CR plus trait. Very well-rounded disease package with average RWST and RWSA. Crystal 932, good supply, a new limited approved variety with average RWST but above average RWSA. A good root rot tolerance package for a nematode tolerant variety. A little bit of weakness on Cercospora. That variety performed #4 on our average of 2 years worth of data. For special approval from ACH, a couple new varieties, both containing the CR plus trait that I'm sure a lot of you have heard about. Excellent for Cercospora tolerance, good overall disease package, but one thing that we've seen on these CR plus varieties, they are a little bit lower than others on RWST. Crystal OG 021, new first year variety, like I said, also with that CR plus trait. Good disease package, slight weakness to root aphids, a little bit higher RWST than some of the other CR plus varieties that were submitted. Beta seed, full approval, 1399 with, just mentioned yesterday at a meeting, no supply. Beta 1703, a very good supply of that. Newer, high yielding with average quality variety. Very good Cercospora tolerance. It's towards the top in our nursery trials. And also good tolerance to alternaria, but a little bit of weakness for Aphanomyces and Fusarium. Beta 188N, very good supply of that. New nematode tolerant variety, high yield and sugar. It's following similar lines to some of our older nematode tolerant varieties with very good yield and some better sugar. A little bit weak on Cercospora, but good root disease traits. A new limited approved variety, Beta 197N, very good supply of that. Has average RWST, but above average RWSA with good root tolerance package. This variety, similar to a lot of the other nematode tolerant varieties, a little bit of weakness to Cercospora. A special approval, Beta 1606 with very good supply of that. High yielding, a little bit below average quality nematode tolerance. Slightly better leaf spot than some of the other high yielding nematode tolerant varieties, and a good overall disease package for root rots. A couple new varieties that both contain the CR plus trait. Beta 1941, a new limited approved variety, as I mentioned, has the CR plus trait. Good overall disease package, but a little bit lower on RWST. And Beta 1065, a new first year CR plus variety, good disease package, a little bit of weakness to root aphids, and slightly lower on RWST. Moving on to Hillshog, fully approved varieties, 9879, good supply of that. A little bit below average yield and quality, nematode tolerance though. Very good Cercospora tolerance for nematode tolerant varieties. It's towards the top for our nematode tolerant varieties in terms of leaf spot tolerance. A little bit weak on Aphanomyces and Fusarium. 9865, it's an above average yield and high quality variety. Fair disease traits, but a little bit weaker on Aphanomyces and Fusarium. Hillshog 9908, a little bit below average yield, but good quality. Very good Cercospora tolerance again here with 9908, and relatively fair disease traits, a little bit weak on Fusarium. Hillshog 2240, a good supply of that, moderate yield and good quality. Very good leaf spot tolerance, but slight weakness to Rhizoctonia and Fusarium. Hillshog 2238 NT, a good supply of that, a new nematode tolerant variety, a little bit better leaf spot tolerance than some of the higher yielding nematode tolerant varieties. A little bit weak on Aphanomyces and Fusarium. A new limited approved variety after 2 years worth of testing, Hillshog 2332. Very good RWST. I think this was the highest RWST out of the 50 varieties that we tested. Slight weakness to Cercospora and Fusarium, but good tolerance to Rhizoctonia. So good root rot tolerance there with Rhizoc and good sugar. Moving on to Marabou, full approval. 709, a good supply of that, moderate yield, but above average quality. Very good Cercospora and Alternaria tolerance, but a little bit weak on the root rots. Marabou 813 NT, a good supply, below average yield with average quality, good leaf spot tolerance. You know, being a nematode tolerant variety, that's important, but a little bit weak on Rhizoctonia and Fusarium. Marabou 814, a good supply of that. New variety with moderate yield and quality, good leaf spot tolerance, but weakness to Rhizoc and Aphanomyces. And on to Cedex, 1264, very good supply of that. That's a high yield and high quality variety, good overall disease package and full root aphid tolerance. 1278, nematode tolerant variety, high yielder with good quality, nematode tolerance, a little bit weak on Rhizoctonia and Cercospora, but otherwise good disease traits. 2283, very good supply. It's another high yielding and high quality variety. Good on leaf spot tolerance, but a little bit weak on Rhizoctonia. The other disease traits are good. Limited approved varieties, 2294, test market supply of that. A new limited approved variety, good RWST and above average RWSA with a little bit of weakness to root aphid. 2295, a trial market, limited approved variety, very good RWST and average RWSA. A very well-rounded disease package on that one. 2296, a new nematode tolerant variety with very good RWST and above average RWSA. Slight weakness to Cercospora and Fusarium. As far as Cercospora and that one goes, it falls in line with a lot of the other nematode tolerant varieties that are available and currently grown in our market. 2297, a new limited approved variety with good RWST, but below average RWSA. A very good Cercospora tolerance, slight weakness to root aphids. Now, just a summary of where we are, where we were, and where we're hopefully headed with our varieties. The green bar on your screens signify RWST. The gray bars are RWSA, and then the orangish red bars are Leafspot. On the left-hand side, you'll see that represents varieties that are older than 3 years. The center 3 bars are varieties that are 2 years old, and then the right-hand bars are first-year varieties on track. So what this chart hopes to represent is that we're maintaining our levels for RWST and RWSA with our varieties, but decreasing our maximum tolerance for leaf spot within the variety portfolio. And that is definitely the direction we need to go with the amount of leaf spot that we've experienced in the last 5 years. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. We'll move on to Dennis Bisher and talking about some of the varieties and their traits.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Thanks, everybody, for coming today, taking some time to join us virtually. I know this is a little different than what we're all used to and probably not how a lot of us would like to do it, but I'm glad to see there were so many participants today that took their time to join us. So today I'm going to talk about a few different things. I want to review a short review of 2020. Corey already went to that some. Then I want to talk about variety tolerance to leaf spot, managing the new highly tolerant CR plus leaf spot varieties, and then variety selection. So first, looking back into 2020, leaf spot control was excellent last year. And that allowed us to have a very good crop, good tonnage, and really good sugar content. And that would not have happened without good disease control. So, but yeah, 2020 was a pretty good year. Looking back at from 2018 to 20, looking at leaf spot, and each fall, the field consultants all rate the fields based on major loss, economic damage, and no damage. So looking at 2018, we had about 50,000 acres that had some sort of economic damage to leaf spot. 2019, last year, that dropped to 10,000 acres. So a nice reduction. And this year, that decreased again to 4,000 acres. So that trend of acres going from 50,000 in 2018 down to 4,000 in 2020 of acres that were economically impacted by leaf spot is definitely a trend in the right direction and where we want to continue to go. So with the minimal impact of leaf spot in 2020, why was that? Well, I think there's a few reasons. One is spray programs. I think we've improved our spray programs in the last couple of years, starting earlier and continuing on tighter schedules. This year, the DSVs were lower than they have been in the last couple of years, but still relatively high. Corey was earlier, I talked about increased genetic tolerance, and that's definitely playing a role as well. And then the final thing I think is that company-wide grower commitment to control. I just think in general, the commitment to controlling leaf spot by all you growers has been increased in the last couple of years. So looking at the spray programs, we now start earlier. Generally, we're getting that first fungicide application on in the end of June. And we've shortened our application intervals. Generally, we're reapplying every 10 to 14 days. We know what adjuvants are performing better and helping with disease control. We've increased coverage. That's so important with especially our protectant fungicides to increase coverage. We've done that by you guys buying the right nozzles, using that with the right pressure and the right amount of water per acre, and then using the best products. Not all products are equal, but we really see the better products being used in general. And so let's look a little closer at the fungicide efficacy. This is from one of the fungicide efficacy trial treatments. On the left is untreated. So that was was completely burned down. Treated with 7 fungicide applications applied starting early and applied at the right time. Did give us some really good control. So the fungicides are working. They're doing their job. We did have some leaf spot pressure this year. As you can see from this trial, this is just natural inoculum. If we would have not sprayed, we would have burned down. Looking at DSVs, so in 2020, we accumulated 202 total DSVs. So that is down from 2019 and 2018. 2018 was our all-time high of DSVs. But still, 202, that's our 4th highest DSV total, and definitely trending higher than it had been in the early to mid 2000s. So the DSVs would suggest that there is some weather patterns are continuing to maybe have a little higher risk of leaf spot infection. But yet we're still getting good control. Looking at that genetic tolerance to leaf spot, Corey had talked about this sooner, but I think it really plays a really big role too in how we're controlling leaf spots. So if you look at 2018, we only had about 18% of our acres planted to a tolerant variety. Last year, that increased to 41%, and this year, half of our acres were planted to a tolerant variety. And that's definitely the direction we want to go and the direction we want to continue. Additionally, we've gone from 30% of our acres being planted to a moderately tolerant variety up to 48% of our acres planted to a moderately tolerant variety. So that's increased as well. And a big change is the reduction in susceptible acres. So in 2018, half of our acres were planted to susceptible variety, and this year we were down to 1%. So basically, very few acres were planted to a susceptible variety. So hopefully that trend continues. Part of the reason for that trend is production of seed, breeding for more tolerant varieties, and then you guys purchasing those varieties as well, signaling demand that you really do want better genetic tolerance to leaf spot. Looking at grower sugar, we had really good increase in grower sugar this year, and that would not have happened without good leaf spot control. If you look at from August into the beginning of September, we were hovering around that 15% sugar range, and then as we hit into September, we started a nice steady increase on sugar content, and that sugar content increase would not have happened without good disease control. So looking at genetic tolerance to leaf spot, all varieties will get leaf spot. Tolerant varieties will slow the disease development and reduce risk, where varieties with less genetic tolerance develop disease earlier in the growing season and becomes more severe. So regardless of the variety, you will get leaf spot. It's just a matter of how soon it develops and how severe it gets. So looking at our Cercospora nursery, Brian talked about the Cercospora nursery earlier. This is looking at 3 different varieties, a tolerant variety on the left. So the tolerant variety still has pretty good canopy, but definitely getting some leaf spot. There's some brown leaves here, a lot of spots. This would be at economic impact on September 16th. A moderately tolerant variety at that point is almost completely burned down, and a susceptible variety is completely burned down. So that's the difference of genetic tolerance to leaf spot going from left to right. Then flashing forward those same varieties to October 7th, now the tolerant variety is almost completely burned down. The moderately tolerant variety is completely burned down, and the susceptible variety has completely burned down and is starting to regrow. So the more tolerant varieties hold off leaf spot earlier. The infection isn't as severe early, but as you get to more susceptible varieties, you get more infection early and more severe. But all varieties will get leaf spot. So what about leaf spot in 2021? There'll be more information on spray programs during the winter meetings. I'm not going to get into that now. But really, variety selection is the first step in a leaf spot control program. This year, we have over 30 varieties approved to plant. Corey mentioned earlier that there was 27 available. You know, of the over 30 varieties, not all of those have seed supply, but there are 30 approved to plant. There's an increase in the number of varieties that are tolerant of leaf spot. So once again, we have more varieties available that are good tolerance to leaf spot. And then we also have the new highly tolerant CR plus varieties, Beta 1941, Crystal 943, Beta 1065, and Crystal 021. So going back to the Cercospora nursery, this is Crystal 675. This is a tolerant variety. It's near the lower end of the tolerant zone, but still considered a tolerant variety. And looking at that variety on August 18th in the nursery was still holding pretty well for leaf spot. We're starting to see some spots on some of these leaves, more than we would definitely like to see on August 18th. But still, August 18th, 675 looks good. September 16th, it gets to almost completely burned down. And then on October 7th, it's completely burned down. Now, if you compare that to Beta 1941, that's one of the new highly tolerant CR plus varieties. On August 18th, there's no spots at all. On September 16th, we still have good disease control, just strictly from genetic tolerance, no fungicides being applied. And on October 7th, we still have a relatively full canopy or a full canopy. The one thing I do notice is the progression of health. So on August 18th, we're still nice green full canopy, and as we move later in the season, we generally want the canopy to yellow up some, but we're maybe not quite as healthy in October as we were in August. So this is showing those all those different varieties on October 7th in the Cercospora nursery again. Highly tolerant variety, still relatively full canopy. Tolerant variety, almost completely burned down. The moderately tolerant variety has completely burned down, and the susceptible variety has completely burned down and started to regrow. So that's the progression of leaf spot based off genetic tolerance. So these are looking at highly tolerant to susceptible varieties, highly tolerant variety being on the left, susceptible variety being on the right. As we move from left to right, all these varieties have good leaf spot control, but the difference in them is the number of fungicide applications. So on the left, we had to spray approximately 3 times to get good disease control on those highly tolerant varieties. And as we move to susceptible varieties, it takes more fungicide applications, up to 8 sprays to get season-long disease control. So looking at fungicide applications by variety, this is all varieties approved to plant except for the new highly tolerant CR plus varieties. And there's quite a range in the number of fungicide applications it's going to take to get season-long disease control. The more tolerant varieties are down around 5 fungicide applications. That continues to increase till we get to the most susceptible varieties, which would be 8 applications or maybe even more. So there is a big difference of number of fungicide applications to achieve season-long disease control based on genetic tolerance. Breaking that out into tolerant, moderate tolerant, highly tolerant. What I wanted to point out here is that even in that tolerant zone, there's quite a bit of range in genetic tolerance. So if you look at the most tolerant varieties in the most tolerant varieties around 5 sprays, and the more susceptible varieties, but still in the tolerant zone, are around 7 sprays. As we get into moderately tolerant and susceptible, it increases to 7, 8, and even 9 sprays. So there is a big range in that tolerant zone from the most tolerant to those varieties that are still tolerant but less tolerant. So I think one thing we need to talk about today is managing the highly tolerant varieties. It's a level of genetic resistance to leaf spot that we haven't really seen before. So how do we manage that? In order to make your decision on if those varieties are right for you to plant, we have to know how many fungicide applications it's going to take to get season-long disease control. When do we start those applications, and what is the application interval? So first, now if we add in the 4 highly tolerant CR plus varieties to this fungicide application by variety graph, we're looking at about 3 fungicide applications to achieve season-long disease control, where we're looking at 5 to 9 on our more traditional varieties. So this would be our recommendations for the highly tolerant CR plus fungicide. So 3 applications starting July 1st, August 1st, and September 1st. So basically you spray on the 1st, the 1st, the 1st. If you're in a program, most people are now on a program where we start late June and then follow that up 10 days later with a tank mix, and then apply every 14 days. So you're probably gonna, if you have both of these varieties, if you have a new highly tolerant variety on your farm And more traditional varieties, you're going to probably spray the highly tolerant varieties every other time. We're still going to rotate fungicide classes, and we're going to tank mix with EBDC or copper, just like we have been. The one thing I will say that we really only have 1 year of data on managing these varieties with fungicides and Leafspot. We were lucky enough to have enough seed to get them into some BEETcast trials and some other trials. So our recommendations may change as we grow and more knowledgeable with these varieties, but right now that's our current recommendation. So this is the BEETcast trial where we had Crystal 943, a highly tolerant variety. On the left is untreated. So that's in one of our research trials, untreated, never sprayed, canopy looks pretty good. Crystal 943, same variety, fungicides applied July 1st, August 1st, and September 1st. So not a huge difference between these two when you look at these pictures farther away. I would say where the fungicides applied, there's a little darker green, a little healthier, a little fuller canopy. But still, there's a lot of years, and most years we'd be pretty happy with this disease control in the past. But as we look closer at this 943 untreated, you can see that we actually are getting a decent amount of leaf spot. We have some leaves that are starting to get some dead areas in them. Look at this leaf here. We have spots scattered throughout and some disease starting to, where the spots are starting to grow together here. So that's at the point where we would say, yeah, we have reached economic impact. There's enough Cercospora in this that we have economic impact. So looking at that leaf spot rating scale and estimated yield loss, a leaf spot rating of a 3 is when we hit economic impact. And I would say that variety was somewhere between over a 3, but probably not quite to a 4 yet, maybe in that 3.5 range. When we get closer to 4, we'll get up to 2 tons of acre of yield loss and a point of sugar. So we were greater than 3, less than 4, but definitely at the point where we're going to start to see some economic impact from leaf spot. So looking at that, continue to look at that BEETcast 943, untreated on the left, treated on the right. Both have a relatively good canopy or a good canopy going into harvest. But let's look at the sugar per acre. Untreated RWSA, 11,570 pounds. The 3 fungicide RWSA had 12,760 pounds of sugar. So we increased sugar content by 1,200 pounds per acre. And that increased revenue by almost $200 per acre. So 3 fungicide applications gave an economic return. We can surely spray 3 fungicides for much less than $200 and less than $100 an acre. So there is a good economic return for spraying 3 fungicides on these highly tolerant varieties, even when we don't get burned down. Once again, continue to tank mix with EBDC or copper. One reason for that is increased disease control. Once again, if you look at Crystal 943 on the left is no tank mix. On the right, EBDC was tank mixed with the fungicide applications. And once again, we have that bigger, greener, darker, fuller canopy from increased disease control. That's also important for resistance management. We need to protect our triazoles, tins, and strobies for as long as we can for continued use. So we're going to continue on a tank mix with EBDC or copper. So summarizing the highly tolerant fungicide recommendations, 3 applications, July 1st, August 1st, September 1st. Still rotate your fungicide classes and tank mix with EBDC or copper. So what about variety selection for 2021? So I think there's some traits that we need to look at and that help make the determination on what to plant. First is leaf spot tolerance. We have the new highly tolerant CR plus varieties that we have to figure out if and how we should incorporate them into your program, and just leaf spot tolerance in general. Still nematodes is of course important. RWST, RWSA are also important. Well, and then other traits that are maybe important to you: Rhizoc, Phanomyces, Fusarium, and emergence. So I want to look a little closer at 2 of the highly tolerant varieties, Beta 1941 and Crystal 943. I'm going to focus more on these 2 because they have a larger supply. The other 2 first-year varieties are really just for a test market and are pretty limited. So the question is, are these varieties right for you? So the first thing we know is they have excellent leaf spot tolerance, these 2 varieties, unlike anything we've ever seen in recent years. But they do have a lower RWST, so their sugar per ton, their percent sugar is lower compared to some of the more traditional varieties. Just hold on, we have one question.
So somebody asked if there was an increase in RWSA in highly tolerant varieties with 7 to 8 sprays.
So the question was there an increase in RWSA on highly tolerant varieties in 7 to 8 sprays? So yes, they did increase sugar per acre by 7 to 8 sprays, but it wasn't significantly more than spraying 3 times. So it's still a benefit, but not the same benefit that we saw with down to 3 fungicide applications. So comparing 675 and 943, just want to look, and the reason I'm comparing these two, we had both of them in our BEETcast trial, so I can make a pretty good comparison here. 675 is a widely grown variety, still with good leaf spot control. So let's compare these two. Crystal 675 versus 943, the new highly tolerant variety. Let's look agronomically when you look at them, they're both are good emergers. Of course, 943 is excellent on leaf spot and 675 is good. 675 is going to be a little better on rhizoc than 943. Both have good root aphid tolerance, similar on Aphanomyces, and 943 is better on Fusarium than 675. So agronomically, they're both pretty sound. They both have their strengths and weaknesses when you look at their agronomic traits. But what about their sugar per acre and sugar per ton? So Crystal 675 has an RWSA of 106. So this is from the OBT trials, it's percent of check. So the higher number is better. Versus Crystal 943 has 100% of check. So a little less sugar per acre with 943. If you look at tons, they're both around 104. So the tons is very similar between these two varieties. So where's the extra sugar coming from per acre? It's coming from RWST. 675 is 101 RWST. Crystal 943 is a 96.3. So those two highly tolerant CR plus varieties do have lower sugar per ton. So let's look at that a little closer, continuing to compare 675 and 943 RWST. So if you look at the RWST from the OBT trials, 675 had a RWST of 317 pounds per ton, 943, 302. So definitely a difference there. 675 had higher sugar per ton. If you look at our BEETcast trial, I sprayed the 1st and the 15th. So that's, so we took 675, generally we'd spray that variety the 1st and the 15th. 943, we sprayed it the same just to see what would happen. Both had really good disease control. And you can see that sugar per ton is still higher with Crystal 675 versus 943. What about when we look at the untreated in the BEETcast trial? Untreated, 675 was 311 RWST, and Crystal 943 was 308. So that sugar per ton really tightens up when you get leaf spot. So that's the two things to take away from that is the effect that leaf spot can have on your RWST, and that these lower RWST leaf spot varieties, if you struggled with leaf spot in the past, you may actually end up with a higher RWST. You know, if you're just a guy that's always having a hard time controlling leaf spot, it may actually be a better variety for you. If you've always done a good job controlling leaf spot and it doesn't seem to be an issue, maybe there's some other varieties that may be a better fit. And if you look at the two pictures here, Crystal 675 untreated, you know, not as bad as we've seen in other years as far as untreated. You know, we got a lot of leaves that we lost here in the center, but not 100% burned down, but still pretty bad. 943, still a full canopy. So switching from leaf spot to nematodes, if you have a nematode in your fields, you have to have nematode resistant varieties. There's really no way around that. If you look at the dollars per acre, this is from the strip trial at Maust that Brian did. $2,000 of revenue in the nematode resistant varieties and the presence of nematodes, $1,550 in the non-nematodes. So almost $500, $450 per acre more revenue just by planting a nematode resistant variety. So if you need a nematode resistant variety, that continues to have to plant those. The downfall of our nematode resistant varieties, none of those are as good on leaf spot, generally speaking. Generally are more susceptible to leaf spot. So this is that fungicide application by variety chart with only the nematode varieties. The most tolerant nematode varieties, we're looking at around 6 sprays. As we get into the more susceptible varieties that are still nematode, we're looking at more at 8 sprays. So once again, those nematode varieties are generally more susceptible to leaf spot. So in the past, we spent a lot of time focusing on leaf spot in the last couple of years and today. As we're getting that disease more in control, although it's still definitely a risk, we can start to focus maybe on some other traits. So one of those things is RWST. Our payment is not on sugar, it's on sugar, not on tons. So RWST is definitely important. We want to maximize RWSA by maximizing RWST. And small increases in RWST are impactful. So I have an example here and a comparison. So if you have a field that's 31 ton per acre with an RWST of 290, you get about 9,000 pounds of sugar per acre. If you take another field that's 30 ton per acre and $300 300 pounds of RWST, you're still at around 9,000 pounds per acre. So if you decrease your yield by a ton, but increase 10 pounds of sugar, you have the same RWSA, same sugar per acre, your payment stays the same, and your dollars per acre stays the same. So that's a benefit. So the 30 ton with 300 RWST is actually better for you. You're going to have less freight, less tons to haul to the factory or the receiving stations. And it's better for the cooperative as well. So what if you can take the same yield, 31 ton, and increase that from 290 pounds of RWST to 300? Your sugar per acre then goes up by 300 pounds to 9,300. Payment is still the same, and you've increased your revenue by $50 an acre by keeping the same yield and increasing your RWST. If you look at that on a larger scale, let's just assume that we can still slice the same amount of tons. Yield stays the same. So we're going to slice 4.5 million tons. You have 290 pounds of RWST versus 300 pounds, still 4.5 million ton, 300 pounds of RWST. We're going to produce about 500,000 more hundredweight of sugar, and that's going to increase revenue for the cooperative at over $16 million. So that 10 pounds of sugar really does add up when you do it over all the tons and all the acres. If you take another comparison, so our top 5 RWST varieties are about 324 pounds of RWST per ton. The bottom 5 are 304. So variety differences are huge, can play a huge role in how much RWST. So 20 pounds of difference between those, the top 5 varieties and the bottom 5 varieties on RWST. Once again, assuming you can keep tons the same, increase of 20 pounds of sugar produces 900,000 more hundredweight of sugar and about $32.5 million increased revenue. So once again, changes in RWST really do affect the overall revenue to the cooperative. So RWST is influenced by leaf spot control, genetic potential, and nitrogen rates. And leaf spot control does directly impact RWST. I'm going to use Crystal 675 as an example again. So on August 18th, this is back to the Cercospora nursery. Still had pretty good disease control, but on September 16th, we were at economic impact, well past economic impact, almost completely burned down. So if a grower's field was burnt down like this on September 16th, and in my opinion, and generally we would say that once you reach that, you're not going to accumulate hardly any sugar for the year, and you may even go backwards. So if you look at grower sugars on September 16th, we were around 16% sugar on September 16th. So if we had a grower field that looked like that, we would not gain these extra 3 points of sugar between the middle of September and permanent pile. So having good leaf spot control is critical to maximizing percent sugar. So looking at the varieties and their 2020 genetic tolerance to leaf spot, we have the 4 varieties that are available that are highly tolerant CR plus varieties, excellent on leaf spot. Then we have 16 varieties that are available that are still tolerant. Once again, there's a range of tolerance within there from a good plus down to a good, a 78% a check to 101, so range within there. We have 6 varieties that are in the moderately tolerant, and then we have 5 varieties that are in the susceptible range. If you'll notice the susceptible varieties, all of those varieties are nematode varieties. So if you're in a non-nematode situation, you likely may have to plant some of those varieties in order to get enough seed to cover your acres. And some of these nematode varieties that are in the susceptible range do offer some other traits such as a higher RWST if you can control leaf spot. So in summary, variety selection summary, leaf spot needs to be a continued priority. And if we don't control leaf spot, we will not maximize the crop. Plant nematode varieties when needed. We need to focus on RWST as well as RWSA. Both of those are important. Sugar per acre is important, but so is sugar per ton. You have a lot of varieties to choose from this year. 27 that are available, over 30 approved. Seed supply is good. Hats off to the seed companies for producing a wide variety of seed and having a good supply. So there's a lot to choose from. I remember it was only a few years ago. It wasn't what you didn't plant what you wanted, you'd plant what you could get, but now the seed supply is really good. And it's really a start to the successful 2021 crop. What you choose in the next few weeks to plant for seed and buy really does start you off for 2021. So thank you. That's all I have. Next up is Daniel Bublitz to give us, to talk about his REACH results.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dennis, for that nice introduction. And thank you all for joining us today for the virtual Seed Week presentation. As Dennis said, today I'll be talking about the Sugarbeet Advancement research trial results. This year, Sugarbeet Advancement had 8 different variety trials located in 7 fields throughout the growing area. 6 of those were here in Michigan, and the other one was in Ontario, Canada. So looking back on the trials for this year, most of our trials had very good weather conditions. We did have some of those freezing conditions early in the season, which caused us to have to replant 3 of our trials. Then our trials in the West District did experience some of those heavy spring rains, particularly the Schaffner and the Chafin trials. Then we also had some stretches of drier weather throughout the summer, and it particularly impacted the DVL trial. And as far as the quality of the data this year, the trials ranged anywhere from fair to excellent. We were able to harvest and use all of the trials that we planted. So we were really very happy about that. All right, so the first chart I'm going to show you today is a summary of the early emergence. So what early emergence is really looking at is how quickly the beets can get up out of the ground and start growing. And so this particular chart is an average of 5 trials, and the counts were, it's a count of the number of beets in 100 feet of row. And those counts were taken about 15 days after planting. And so if you look on this chart and the rest of the charts that I'll be showing today, you'll see a red line that goes across the top. And what that indicates is that any variety whose bar is above that is not significantly different from the top variety. So like in this example, Crystal 675, which is our top early emerging variety, would be statistically the same as Crystal 752. But it would be significantly different from Marabou 709. So what we see with the early emergence this year in our trials is that the beta and crystal varieties were all in that top grouping, and they were significantly better than the rest of the varieties that we tested this year. However, when it comes to final emergence, we kind of see that trend switch a little bit. A lot of those beta and crystal varieties fall out of that top grouping, and instead we have each one of the 3 CX varieties in that top grouping, as well as Hillshog 2238 and Crystal 752. And so this chart again is an average of 5 trials, and this count was taken between 30 and about 45 days after planting. So as far as disease pressure in our trials this year, we actually saw a higher level of root disease this year than what we did last year. And we saw mostly Rhizoctonia root rot, but we also observed some Aphanomyces and Fusarium root rot. Then in terms of foliar diseases, we saw lower levels of Cercospora and Alternaria in all of our trials this year. And in fact, the levels were low enough that we weren't able to rate any of our trials for those diseases. And now, when it comes to Cercospora especially, we've had 2 years back-to-back now that we've had fairly low levels of Cercospora throughout the growing area, which that's going to be very helpful for management going forward by reducing the amount of inoculum that's in the area. However, if we slack off now with our management, we could still have a big problem with this disease going forward because there still is plenty of inoculum out there to allow it to cause problems for us. So as Dennis mentioned in his presentation, variety selection is still a very important tool for managing this disease, and you should still definitely be considering planting those resistant varieties. All right, so now on this chart, I have a summary of our dead beet counts that we took from our trials. This is again an average of 5 variety trials. And what the dead beet count is it's the number of beets in 1,200 feet of row that are either dead or dying, and that death is usually caused by one of those 3 root diseases that I mentioned earlier. And so this chart's a little bit different from all the other ones that I'm showing today, in that a lower number here is better, because that indicates that fewer beets have been killed by these root diseases. And then also with the red line here, any variety that's beneath that line now is not significantly different from the best one. So in terms of the dead beet counts, our best variety was Crystal 855, and then all 3 of the beta varieties and Crystal 675 were not significantly different from that variety. One thing I want to mention here as well is that in the average and in most of our individual trials, CDX 1278 had the highest dead beet count. And I think that is in large part due to its susceptibility to Rhizoctonia. So even though this variety did perform quite well in a lot of our trials, I would caution everyone about planting it because of that susceptibility to Rhizoctonia. And so if you do decide to plant this, be very careful about where you place it on your farm, and don't plant this in a field that has a history of Rhizoctonia root rot. And if you do decide to plant this variety, be sure that you give it 2 applications of Quadris. So now I'm going to talk about the yield results for our trials. And this chart shows the RWSA for an average of 6 trials. And our top variety here was Cedex 2283. And there were a total of 9 varieties that were not significantly different from the top one. And one thing, as I was doing the statistical analysis on my data and making these charts, the first thing I noticed was how tightly grouped together my varieties were this year in terms of RWSA. So if you compare this year's data to 2019's data, last year, the difference between the top variety for RWSA and the bottom variety was about 2,152 pounds of sugar. This year, however, the difference was only about 630 pounds. And so when you have the data grouped this tightly together, it makes it really difficult to be able to determine which one's better or worse than for your farm. And so what I would advise everyone is that you definitely want to take the RWSA ranking into account. And I would definitely recommend that you plant one that's within this top grouping. But then equally important to where it falls in this metric is considering all the other traits that it brings to the table. So considering which ones of those, including nematode tolerance, disease resistance, and things like that, think of which one is most important for your farm and try to pick a variety in that top grouping that also brings those important traits to the table. All right, so this chart now is showing the average tons per acre for our varieties. And again, very similar to the RWSA, we had a very tight grouping for tonnage this year. So the difference from the top tonning variety to the bottom tonning variety was about 2.7 tons, whereas last year that difference was about 7.5 tons. So one thing that we do see here is that all 3 of the beta and crystal varieties were again in that top grouping for tonnage. So for RWST, we actually saw a similar difference this year as far as the separation goes between our varieties as what we did last year. And so the difference between the top and the bottom variety for this metric is about 20 pounds of sugar. And so we actually had 2 varieties that were within that top grouping, with the top one being Cedex 1278, followed by Cedex 2283. And so the fact that Cedex 1278 did so well for sugar in our trials was really kind of interesting. It actually won 7 of the 8 variety trials as far as sugar goes, which when you compare it back to Michigan sugar data, it seems like it shouldn't be that high. So we're not quite sure what's happening here. And again, with that variety, I would caution you to be careful about where you place that. And again, to not put it into a Rhizoctonia field. All right, so now I'm going to shift gears and take my focus away from the overall averages and instead be talking about the individual variety trials that we had. So the first one I'm going to talk about today is the Schaffner trial that was over by Freeland. This one was planted on April 20th and harvested October 3rd. The overall quality of this trial was excellent. So a few of the key things I want to point out about this trial is that the field was a heavy clay loam soil, and this field went through a major rain event on May 18th. In fact, it received greater than 5 inches of rainfall that day. So in the pictures I have on the screen, the top picture is not the variety trial. That's the field across the road from the trial. Whereas the bottom picture is of our variety trial. You can see that there is a little bit of standing water here and a lot of standing water across the road from the trial. And so that really shows just how much rainfall they did receive. But thankfully, we don't really believe that this had a major long-term impact on the trial. The water did drain off fairly quickly, and it doesn't really seem like it had a major impact on the quality of the data. And in fact, after doing the analysis, it seems like this was probably our best trial as far as data quality goes for this year, and one of the best that Advancement has had for quite a few years. So a couple of things that did impact the way that the varieties performed here was that there was a moderate level of root disease in this trial. We did see some Rhizoctonia, Aphanomyces, and Fusarium. And then as far as the leaf spots go, there was a low level of leaf spot at this trial for both Cercospora and Alternaria. But we did find Cercospora relatively early in the season for this year, on July 24th, this trial. But in spite of finding it then, the levels still remained low throughout the season and never did reach the economic threshold. All right, so as far as the varieties stacked up here in terms of RWSA, our top variety was Cedex 2283, followed by Beta 1703, and then Cedex 1278. then there were several other varieties that were within that top grouping. So the other trial that we had in the West District was the Chaffin trial over by Ithaca. This one was planted on April 20th and harvested on October 15th. The overall quality of this trial was good. So a few of the things I want to point out here was that it was planted into a stale seed bed, and it was impacted by that major rain event in May. And it appeared as though the rain event had more of an impact on this trial than what it did on the Schaffner trial. Then we also had a few crusting issues here right around the time of emergence, but thankfully we had a timely rain that came in and was able to soften that crust so we had an acceptable stand in this trial. Then we also observed a fairly low level of root disease here, but we did see some Aphanomyces because of, probably because of those spring rains. So probably the most important characteristic of this trial was the variability in soil texture here. So in the front half of the field, that was a fairly heavy clay loam soil. So the beets didn't look quite as good here. I mean, they were healthy enough, but they were fairly small. But in the back of the field, that was a lighter, loamy type soil. And back there we had exceptional beets, but they were a little bit less consistent than what they were up in the front. So you can see that there's some yellow patches kind of sprinkled in in that green area, than an area where we didn't have quite as good of emergence. So Tom and I actually worried about this trial all summer long. We weren't sure if we were actually going to be getting any good usable data from it. But after we harvested the trial and ran the analysis, the data was of a very good quality, well, good quality. And so we feel very comfortable in using it and showing it to you today. So what we think it probably was that even though the beets were a little bit patchy here and there's maybe a little bit less consistent, we think that influenced the entire trial evenly throughout. So it was even in its inconsistency, if you will. All right, so at this trial, we actually had some better separation in our varieties in terms of RWSA than what we saw in most of our other trials. So here, the top variety was Hillshog 9865, followed by CDX 2283, and then finally CDX 1264. So interestingly here, tonnage was not significant for the trial, but RWST was. And so we think that the sugar had a large factor in driving in how the varieties performed at this particular location. So moving into the Central District, the first trial that I'll talk about from here is the Sylvester trial from Quantica C. This one was planted on April 19th and harvested on October 12th. And the overall quality of this trial was very good. So this trial was actually originally in the spring, the very first variety trial that we had planted. We originally planted it on March 27th, but because of those freezing temperatures, we had to replant the field. And so in this case, the field was worked before replanting, which again, that took place on April 19th. So the two major factors that influenced how the varieties did here was the presence of Sugarbeet nematode and a moderate level of root disease. So we observed Rhizoctonia, Aphanomyces, and Fusarium all in this field. And then for most of the summer, the level of Cercospora leaf spot here was low, but we did see an increase in that towards the end of the season, so going into September. But it still remained below the economic threshold and didn't really influence how the varieties performed. So in this particular trial, we actually had 9 varieties that were within that top grouping. And the top 3 were Beta 188, followed by Crystal 752, and Beta 1606. And so here we actually had the opposite thing happen of what we had at the Chaffin trial. Here, RWST was not significant, but tonnage was significant. And the 2 top varieties for tonnage here were Beta 188 and Beta 1606. So the other trial that we had in the Central District was the Shooty trial from up by Elkton. This one was planted on April 18th and harvested on October 14th. And the overall quality of this trial was good. So a couple of the key things I want to point out here was that it did have dairy manure applied the fall before the trial was planted. And this trial also experienced some stretches of dry weather throughout the summer. And there was a moderate level of root disease here, but we primarily saw just the Rhizoctonia in this particular trial. We actually saw both the root and crown rot. And so you can see a picture of what the crown rot looks like up on the top photo here. And this was actually the only trial where I saw a significant amount of that crown rot. So I thought that was kind of interesting to point out. Then at this trial, we did find just a very low level of Sugarbeet nematode, And I think that level was low enough that it really didn't influence how the varieties performed. So in this trial, our top variety was Crystal 675. And the other two in the top three were Beta 1606 and Cedex 1278. We did have several others that were within that top grouping, which weren't significantly different from the top variety. But as I said, Crystal 675 was the top variety here, and it seemed to really perform very well at this particular trial. So moving into the east, the first trial I'll talk about from over there is the DVL trial from over by Ruth. This one was originally planted on April 4th into a loamy sand soil type. We also had a wheat cover crop that we planted into, which was killed then a few weeks after planting. And so here, we actually did experience those freezing temperatures again. And so the grower decided to replant this trial, which we did on May 3rd. Here though, we didn't want to disturb the wheat cover crop, so we actually planted right into the first planting. And because of that, we had beets from both the first and the second planting that survived. And so we had a much higher population here than what we had in most of our other trials. And so here we had an average population of about 303 beets in 100 feet of row, whereas the rest of our trials had an average final population of about 215 beets in 100 feet. And so this trial was harvested on October 30th, and the overall quality of this trial was fair. And so because of the loamy sand soil type that it was planted into, and because of the way that the weather conditions were in the east this year, this one was more impacted by the dry weather than what our other trials were. You can see how wilted the beets are in that top photograph. So at this trial, we unfortunately did not see a significant difference in any of our varieties as far as RWSA goes. And so what this means statistically is that we really didn't have a first place or a last place variety here. And in terms of the stats, they all yielded the same. So moving into Canada, our trial over there this year was with Stephen Kearns. It was planted on April 27th and harvested on October 14th. The overall quality of this trial was excellent. So unfortunately, Tom and I were unable to travel to Canada this year due to the COVID-19 restrictions that were in place. However, we were still able to have this trial over there because Wayne Martin, the Michigan Sugar Field Consultant, was gracious enough to help us manage the trial this year. And so we're very grateful to him, and I want to give him a special thank you at this time. So thank you, Wayne, for volunteering to do that. So this trial was planted into a loam soil type, and there was a very low level of both root and foliar disease at this trial. So here, even though we had excellent quality data, we again did not see significant difference in RWSA between any of our varieties here. So again, in terms of the stats, there was no difference between any of these varieties, and they yielded the same. So that was the same for both RWSA and for tons in this particular location. However, for RWST, we did see a significant difference for that metric. And so we had 4 varieties that were in the top grouping as far as that goes, with the top variety being Cedex 1278, followed by Cedex 2283, then Hillshog 9865, and Beta 1703. So probably the most interesting trial that we had this year was the Wadsworth trial. This was originally planted on April 6th, and it was one of the earliest trials that we had planted, but again, it experienced those freezing conditions and some crusting issues at this location, which greatly reduced the stands from what we'd like to see. And so the grower here decided to replant this trial, but instead of working up the old one and replanting in the same spot, he actually planted the new trial adjacent to the old one. And so essentially here then we had 2 different trials, the Wadsworth early and the Wadsworth late plantings. So the late planting was done on May 7th. And at this trial, we had a nearly perfect stand because the weather was ideal for emergence after planting. Both these trials were harvested on November 3rd, and the overall quality of them was good. So in addition to the planting date and to the population, the other thing that really influenced this trial was disease pressure. And so we had a high level of sugarbeet cyst nematode at this trial and a very high level of rhizoctonia root rot here. So we also did observe some alternaria leaf spot that came in later in the season, but that never reached a level of causing economic damage, and we weren't able to rate for that because there wasn't quite enough of it to do so. So one other really interesting thing that I want to point out here at this trial, and this really didn't have an impact on yield and didn't impact how the varieties performed, but I just thought it was really cool to mention, is that I found a beet here that had an enormous sugar beet crown gall. So crown gall it's fairly rare to see. You don't see a ton of this every year, but I'll often see one or two within the trials throughout the season. But this one was really kind of unique because it was enormous. It was about the size of a softball. It was actually as big as the rest of the beet. So this summer, we actually had some drone pictures taken of these two trials. And this first one is of the early planting. So you can see how much thinner the beets are here. You can actually see patches of ground in the photograph. And then you can also see some patches where, and you can't quite see this from the aerial photo, but when you're on the ground, you can see that some of these patches are caused by Rhizoctonia root rot. Now this picture is of the late planting, and you can see here that the stand was a lot thicker, and you can see consistent beets all throughout the trial, but you can still see a few patches where Rhizoctonia was killing some of the beets. So as far as the variety stacked up for yield, the first thing that we noticed was that there was a huge difference between the nematode and the non-nematode varieties here. And that's undoubtedly driven by that high nematode pressure that I mentioned. And because of that nematode pressure, it's really not fair to evaluate the non-nematode varieties at this location. And so this location for both the early and the late planting should just be used to evaluate those nematode varieties. And so in the early planting, within those nematode varieties, there was no significant difference between any of the 5. But as far as the ranking goes, we think that was probably driven by the populations, which I have up on the screen now, with Cedex 1278 and Hillshog 2238 having the highest populations of those nematode varieties, and the other ones having lower populations. So then with the late planting, again, we see this huge difference between the nematode and the non-nematode varieties. And again, we really shouldn't be evaluating the non-nematode varieties at this location. But within the nematode varieties here, there actually was a significant difference between some of those varieties. And the top 2 here were Beta 188 and Crystal 752. And both of those were significantly different than the other 3 nematode varieties here. And this time with the final populations, there wasn't that much of a difference between these, and they were really all in the acceptable range. So now up on the screen, I have a comparison of the nematode varieties compared to each other in terms of revenue for both the early and the late planting, and the final population for the early and the late planting. Now there's a lot of really interesting material here that I want to go into a lot of depth in, but unfortunately I don't have the time to do that right now. But I promise I'll get back to talking about that at the winter agronomy meetings. So the last thing that I want to point out about this trial is the difference in size between the beets in the early and the late planting. So in both the pictures that I have on the screen now, those were taken of the same variety, and the ones on the left were from the early planting, and the ones on the right were from the late planting. So you can see just how much larger the early planting ones were because they had more time and more room to grow, because populations were lighter there. So in conclusion, when it comes to the trials for this year that Advancement did, I was really very happy with the quality of the data that we had. We were able to use all 8 of the variety trials that we had. However, when it comes to looking for differences in the yield between the individual varieties, the differences were really very narrow this year, and they were really all grouped very closely together. And so actually 2 of our individual trials had no significant difference when it came to RWSA. But, and then also for the average RWSA, there were 9 varieties that were in that top grouping. And then the difference from the highest to the lowest was only about 600 pounds of sugar. And we also saw a similar trend with tonnage, with 6 being in that top grouping, and a difference of only 2.7 tons from the highest to the lowest. And so when it comes to selecting varieties, when the data groups this closely together, that makes it really tough to be able to pick out which ones were the best in terms of yield. And so what I would recommend that everyone does is that they do still consider the RWSA data and ranking for these trials. And you want to be selecting a variety that's in that top grouping. But equally important to that, you want to consider all the other traits that these varieties bring to the table. So you definitely want to be considering things like nematode tolerance, And I think the Wadsworth trial really exemplified just how important that is if you have a nematode presence in your field. And it's also important to be considering disease resistance, particularly for Cercospora and Rhizoctonia, then also looking at RWST and emergence, and the other traits that are listed in the Michigan sugar data. And so by considering all of these factors and which ones are the most important for your individual farm, that's the best way to optimize your variety selection and to put yourself in the position to have the maximum yield for next year. So now I'd like to take a moment to thank all of the grower cooperators who volunteered to have trials on their farm. Because without all of you, your help and support, we couldn't be able to do all this work that we have done this year to give you the data that we presented here. So thank you all very much for volunteering to do that. And with that, I'll take any questions that you have this time. And if you're uncomfortable in asking a question from the big group, you can always contact me by either phone or email later, and that information is in the variety book. Thank you.
So the question was, Elizabeth, the cold germ? Is that what the question was?
On the varieties for this year?
Yeah, so we wouldn't know the cold germ for the varieties for this year. That's up to the seed companies to do that testing as they process seed. We do know in the past there's been some varieties that have performed better, you know, on some years because of their cold germ, but we don't know that yet today.
Next question, can you explain what crown gall is?
All right, so the question was, what is crown gall? So crown gall it's generally bacterium, but it can also be caused by certain species of fungi that actually infect the beet earlier in the season, and they create chemicals which cause it to produce this growth or tumor essentially. And so again, so the short answer is yes, it's a bacterium or a fungus that infects the beet. And generally we see low enough levels of that they don't cause any sort of economic impact to the fields. So they're generally not an issue.
So alternary ratings, we can only rate it when the disease is present. So we took the ratings off of the spreadsheet because we didn't have ratings for all the varieties, because some of the varieties are first year or second year. We were not able to produce any alternary ratings for 2019 or 2020. So we therefore can't put any on the spreadsheet. We do have a background with some of the older varieties, and we are working with the USDA here in Michigan to try to set up an alternary nursery. But currently in North America, there are no alternary nurseries for us to enter those varieties. We do, both our field staff and our research staff keep a keen eye out for whether or not alternaria is affecting that, and we do rate trials for it when it does present itself.
So yeah, I think that Crystal 670, so the question was 675 versus 943. I would say if you can control leaf spot in both of those varieties, even though you spray extra times with the Crystal 675, is going to be, your economic return is likely going to be higher because of its higher RWST. So yeah, I would say if you're doing a good job controlling leaf spot, Crystal 675 could have a higher RWST, higher dollars per acre. But at the same time, you know, this new technology, this new CR plus varieties, we do need to get some of them out in the field. We need to learn about them. That's probably where we're going to continue to go going forward with higher tolerance to leaf spot.
Hopefully people can hear me. So we try to widely distribute our varieties through our variety trial harvest throughout the course of the season. We keep a good eye on how the sugars accumulate over the season. I know Sugarbeet Advancement has done some studies in past years. Basically, what we've seen is there's a linear accumulation of sugar based on the variety's genetic ability to produce sugar. So a variety that's high in sugar at the end will therefore be higher in sugar earlier. But with that being said, growers can customize their own portfolio of varieties. If they know they're going to harvest a certain field early, if you plant a variety that has higher sugar, it will more than likely have that higher sugar early. But all these numbers can change based on the ability to control disease and other things with the stand, planting date, a lot of things. But generally, sugar accumulates linear between varieties. So a variety that's high early will be higher later. A variety that's low early will be lower later also.
So for some reason, Elizabeth, they can't hear your questions. I don't know what's going on, so if you want to ask us
Just
a question.
leave this unmuted.
Okay, I'll just leave that on. Can everyone hear me now? I guess. Type in yes if you can hear me now. Okay, so people can hear me now. All right, so we're just gonna leave myself and the presenter unmuted. Okay, next question. Do any of the seed companies have a nematode variety that is going to be leaf spot resistant coming out soon?
You'd have to ask each of the individual seed companies that when the CR Plus trait was released, that was my first question also, because I know a lot of growers who are local to my general living area would benefit from that. We do have nematode tolerant varieties that do have good Cercospora scores, relatively good, but they are a little bit lower yielding. So you have to take into consideration what's most important to you and what your ability to control disease is.
Okay, next question. This is a question for Daniel. Do you think the speed of emergence at Wadsworth early impacted stand relative to the freezing conditions? Did the quicker ones freeze off and result in a lower final population?
So that's absolutely what happened. It seems like a lot of those quicker ones, especially the beta and crystal ones, they were up and out of the ground sooner than what the other ones were. And so they got hit harder by those freezing conditions, it appears. So then the ones that were a little bit slower in that particular case fared better as far as the stand goes. And so really, as far as speed of emergence, it's really hard to tell if emerging faster or slower is better in certain years, just because of how the weather behaves, right? So if you're gonna have a frost that happens a bit earlier, then maybe you want later emergence, and if it happens a bit later, then maybe, that can affect that, so.
Next question. So a variety that has lower overall tons at the end, do they have a good chance of having better tons early on in August?
Yeah.
For a variety that has a lower overall tons at the end, do they have a good chance of having better tons early on in August?
Yeah. I don't know.
Go ahead.
I'll over here. So I would say that generally it would be the tonnage would be similar to what Brian said about sugar content. It's going to be linear. If they're higher tonnage late, they're going to be higher tonnage early. So generally that follows the same trend. The higher yielding varieties are higher yielding early, and lower yielding varieties are lower yielding early. So that same trend continues when you go from early to permanent pile, generally speaking. In the absence, once again, in the absence of diseases or other outside factors.
Just to add on to that a little bit, one thing that we've noticed a lot in our harvest date studies, I know Daniel, Michigan Sugar Company, Sugarbeet Advancement have both done these. Accumulation of sugar and tonnage over time isn't necessarily linear. It's more reflective based on the environment that the variety or the field, the growing conditions are. If we get an excess amount of rain, you'll see tons spike and sugar drop. And then the inverse will happen if you go through a spout of dry weather where you'll still get a continued increase in tonnage. It'll just slow. Very rarely does it ever go stagnant, but then sugar content, because the varieties will be slightly dehydrated. So that's one other thing to take into consideration. You'll see Dennis's chart there that he had, and I think it's been released in our Growing Better Together releases as well, that when we started to see those cooler temperatures, as Corey mentioned, the varieties really started to pack on that sugar, and that's really important every year to get that increase in sugar.
All right, next question. The final emergence scores reversed on some varieties on the REACH trials. Was this observed in OBT trials?
What again?
The final emergence scores reversed on some varieties on the REACH trials. Was this observed in OBT trials?
So in the OBT trials, we typically do not do both early and late emergence counts because those trials in history have been thinned. So we don't do an early count versus a late count. We just do an overall count and then thin to population. This year, we were able to do some stand counts early and late because all of those trials were planted to stand. But we did not see a big difference in between early and late counts as they did in the Sugarbeet Advancement trials. One thing to have note though, a lot of our trials are planted with varieties that are not necessarily commercial produced varieties. Because a lot of them are still experimental, so they might not have the same treatments that a commercial variety has.
Okay, next question. Are the seed companies going to charge so much more for the CR Plus seed that it will be as expensive as a Tolerant variety with more fungicide applications?
So this is really probably a question that's better answered by the seed companies, but they are charging a premium for the CR Plus. I'll let you talk to each individual salesperson. It equates, depends on what your seeding population is. It's probably around $30 an acre roughly, but depends on population. But yeah, there is an increased charge for the increased disease tolerance.
Do you have any more questions? I'll give another minute or so for people to enter questions if they have questions. Okay, I think that's it. We will post the slides on Ag Updates either later today or tomorrow, and this presentation will also be available as well as all the videos from the seed companies. They all submitted presentations, and they will be on our YouTube channel. So I will post a link for that as well as this presentation. We really appreciate everybody hopping on. We had over 200 people on at one point. And we just appreciate the participation and handling us as we manage through some of these technical difficulties. So this definitely isn't the normal way that we like to do seed meeting, but this was the best way we could think of to manage it this year. And if you have any questions, feel free to call your seed or your field consultant, or anybody that presented today. So thank you guys, and we are all set.
Anybody gets to see the products? Whether you perceive Just checking, I had a question.